Well, today is a busy day. I know many of you, like as Jet referenced, we are getting here to the end of the year and the holidays. Tonight is the Rare Voice Awards, which is a big deal, I know, in the rare disease community. And so we're starting bright and early, and we will get underway and anticipate that more folks will join us. This quote unquote episode of our coffee chat is actually one of the most popular ones we do every year. At the end of the year, we feature leading women who are trailblazers in their field. We'll explore some of your wisdom, learn about your career path, how you came to lead the organizations you do, and also take audience questions. A lot of times folks, especially up and coming in the patient advocacy space, just love having the opportunity to have this hour of mentorship from folks like yourself. So I am joined today, I'm very honored to be joined today by Pat Furlong, who is the founder, CEO of PPMD, Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy. Julie Gerberding, who I know many of you know from her leadership at Merck, where she was the chief patient officer and ran all of communications and public affairs, but before that was the director of the Centers for Disease Control and the trailblazer in that role. And a woman who needs no introduction, but I will introduce her anyway, Phyllis Greenberger, who I have known for many years, both personally and professionally. I consider her an aunt. And she was at my children's B'nai Mitzvah, and who really is, I think, in so many ways, the reason for so many women being in the patient advocacy space and the health advocacy space is really the trailblazer that ensured that sex differences were recognized and that women would be included in clinical trials. So we will be talking to each of these amazing women. I'll kind of do this like my little Oprah show, where I interview and kind of ask folks questions. But of course, at any point, any of the speakers, please feel free to weigh in and share your thoughts. And toward the end, we'll talk a little bit. Phyllis actually has a book coming out, so I want to make sure that we talk a little bit about that. So with that, we'll get started. I like to start off by just seeing if there's anybody new to the coffee chat community or the patient advocacy community who is on the line that might want to introduce themselves and be welcomed in.
Hi, this is Anika Rahman. I'm the International Advocacy and Policy Director for AI Arthritis. Thank you for having me.
Oh, great. Thank you. Welcome. We're just glad you're here. We were just talking about AI arthritis yesterday and the leadership around.
Oh, good. Good stuff, I hope. Good stuff.
Yes, absolutely. Excellent. So can folks hear me? One of my earbuds went out. So
yes.
Okay, good. All right. So thank you again. We will put, I think Swapna may have already done so, put up the biographical sketches for our esteemed speakers in the chat so you can look up more about them. So I'm going to start with you, Julie Gerberding, and Michelle Guadalupe, who is with Eczema and previously Arthritis Foundation, had an opportunity to intern at CDC when she was earning her MPH. And I actually have several MPHs on my team as well. So you are very much an inspiration for folks in this field. In particular, I would say that women in the professional world and in the biopharmaceutical space, because there's so many prominent men in our field. But part of the reason we host this coffee chat is because so many people up and coming in the patient advocacy space are women. So I think I'll start with you, Julie. Tell us a little bit about sort of what led you into medicine, and in particular, that focus on infectious disease that led you to a CDC.
Well, thank you. And I wish we were all together in person, because I'm sure there are just some really amazing people on this call. I really appreciate having a chance to talk. The story of my beginnings in medicine goes back until the time I was 4, and someone gave me a doctor kit. It was a pretty linear path to end up in medical school. I just dreamed of it from the time I was a little girl and kind of organized my whole life around getting to a good medical school. But there was a little digression along the way, because I lived across the street from the veterinarian in our small community in South Dakota. And so I was really fascinated by animals and was constantly bringing him the injured bird or the grasshopper that had been blinded or whatever, and thought a little bit about being a veterinarian. But in those days, I didn't know any girls who were veterinarians, and it just seemed like that wasn't a job for a woman. And so I didn't follow that path, and I'm not sorry I didn't, but it's just kind of where the gender card got played very early in my life. But infectious disease was not what I started out being interested in. I think, planning on probably being an endocrinologist, in part because I'd done research when I was an undergraduate with this amazing woman who was a PhD scientist and worked with prairie dogs and other animals. So I spent time in her lab and really got enamored of the endocrine system. But when I started my residency at UCSF, it was at the very beginning of the AIDS pandemic. And you couldn't really work at San Francisco General Hospital without being interested in infectious diseases and some of its myriad complications, particularly with that deadly pathogen. So kind of got off to a digression in that space, and I'm really glad I did.
That's fantastic. So what led you into a field, kind of a career in the federal sector?
It was an accident. When I was at UCSF, I was a tenured professor of sorts, and I had a lab and lots of fellows and lots of research funding, and I was pretty early in my career, and they invited me to come to lead a very small piece of the CDC called the Division of, well, at that time, Hospital Infections Program, but otherwise now known as the Division of Healthcare Quality Promotion. And I wasn't interested in doing it, but I went there to try to give little grand rounds and talk about what I, as a hospital epidemiologist, thought would be most helpful things for CDC to be doing. And one thing led to another, so I went on a leave of absence to lead that division for a few years. And that was a really good leadership lesson, because I thought that I was on a straight path at UCSF, having tenure and lab and lots of people and funding and exciting work. But I did take the side trail on a leave of absence, and I had to get up enough courage to ask for that leave of absence. So the real truth of it is I went to the dean and the chair with a list of the top 10 reasons why they should give me a leave of absence for 5 years to go and serve my country. One of my reasons was, well, you let Dr. Harold Varmus go to the NIH on a leave of absence. And the dean said, Jill, you do know that Dr. Varmus has a Nobel Prize. You do not. But anyway, I think because of my temerity, they allowed me to take a leave of absence. And that's how I first ended up at CDC, and happened to be there as the anthrax attacks followed 9/11. And that really kind of roller coastered me into leading the CDC from that point forward.
Thank you so much. So I'll turn to Pat. Your story and how you came to lead PPMD, I know is a different one, certainly, and I know both an incredibly inspiring and yet heartbreaking story. I think we all know that you are carried forward every day with the memory of Christopher and Patrick. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your family journey, but then how PPMD came to be. So I'll turn it over to you for a little bit.
Sure. Thank you, Michelle, and thank you for inviting me to this amazing coffee talk. I'd love to be in person as well. So my career has been in medicine. I have a master's degree in med-surg nursing and ran intensive care units and renal dialysis during a time when we experienced both a heparin shortage for renal dialysis way back then, as well as policy issues regarding families' insurance on chronic dialysis, where their insurance caps would be met within about 6 months, because this was an inpatient, at the time it was inpatient dialysis. So my career being in adult medicine was really based on the fact that seeing sick children was really hard for me. I really struggled in my pediatric clinicals to go into hospitals where there were sick children, always wishing that I could have a magic wand to fix them and enable them to go home to the life they'd planned. And as you might imagine, I planned for a similar life to watch my family grow. In 1984, as my little boys were 4 and 6 years old, I worried about their function. I worried that they appeared quieter than their peers. I worried that they really were reluctant to do stairs. I had a diagnostic odyssey, even though my husband is a physician, to try to understand what was I looking at, because he had been a football player. So the sort of the discussion was they'll grow into those very large muscles. When finally Chris injured his Achilles tendon and cried during the night, and I met with an orthopedic surgeon who said, just on looking at Chris, he has Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and asked me what his younger brother Patrick looked like, and I said the same. At that time, very little was known other than we drew a blood test called a CK, and the CK was usually normals were 4 to, really depending on the lab, 400 and under, depending on the lab values. And Chris's that day after the injury was 72,000. So we knew we were looking at muscle injury and muscle change. And so I tried to, at that time, again, as Julie mentioned, women struggled to get into places places where there would be sufficient expertise. So I decided that in order to really understand the field of, what did we know, how well characterized was this disease, where were the standards of care, where's the data, where's the investment, and is industry trying to develop therapies? I acted as a postdoc and made appointments at all the major labs to understand those questions. And I found that it was much easier to get into the labs as a potential postdoc or a clinician in medical school than it was to be a mother who would cry about the diagnosis that she had. And from there, excuse me, I started PPMD because I felt like if we developed community, we could then attack these problems by investing in them, by thinking about policy, and by going forward.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And indeed, you are such an inspiration. So when was PPMD founded? And tell us a little bit about what PPMD does, what PPMD stands for, is Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy, of course. Go ahead.
Well, again, the name isn't very creative, but way long ago, we are now 30 years old in 2024. So it's been a very interesting journey to really develop and understand what are those steps and tools you have to create and develop in order for progress. So in those 30 years, we really look at ourselves as 4 pillars, and that is research and care and community and education. So we focus on those 4 pillars to drive all of what we do. Care, of course, standards of care, and trying to improve that, and looking at topic-specific meetings such as GIGU or pulmonary or cardiac, and research to invest not only in basic science, but to help small companies move forward and to look at the gaps or the information they need. And that sort of reaches into policy, because we have been meeting with FDA repeatedly since about 2009 and really trying to explain to them what it is like to live with Duchenne. And now there are listening sessions, which are amazing. But at that time, the FDA and PPMD decided that we would look at preference studies and develop a series of preference studies, so we understood benefit risk and how the analysis and how parents and families would analyze various opportunities. So that led to our community and developing a community. We will have our 30th conference this year on the last weekend of June in Orlando, Florida, which is where we started with conference number 1. And we will be thinking about those 30 years in progress. So today we have about 43 companies working on therapy development, 7 approvals, 1 pending for March of this year, and very excited about the new era of gene therapies.
So that is so exciting. I first started working with you, Pat, when I was at Lilly, and I know there was a interest in looking at tadalafil PDE5 drug, which Cialis, which we were exploring for pulmonary hypertension, but potentially also as part of our pediatric plan, our BPCA PRIA study in Duchenne. So, and that's when I first learned about the preference study work. And I'm sure I will botch it, so we'll ask you to be more eloquent than I, but FDA was looking for very specific measures. I think it was the 6-minute walk test and some other things, and the parents really felt the people closest to the boys really felt that there were observed, both from a patient perspective, but quality of life perspective, different measures would sort of be it more indicative of progress. So do you mind talking a little bit about that?
Sure, no, not at all. The 6-minute walk test. So first of all, in rare diseases, we very often, or most of the time, you don't have a sensitive measure to really understand what does benefit look like. And furthermore, in a rare disease, when we talk about cures, but the reality is that's a very big reach in a cure disease, especially early on. So what we wanted to understand is, first of all, what did our families think of the 6-minute walk test? Was that important to them, that these children were able to walk a certain number of meters in 6 minutes? And the answer was it wasn't important. Walking is important, but walking 6 minutes was not important. So we really started the first preference studies really to examine, well, what is important? What by definition do you anticipate or expect from benefit, in terms of benefit from a given therapeutic approach, and what risk will you take to participate in that study or take that particular indication? So we learned a lot about the 6-minute walk test was in fact not a priority, and furthermore, what we learned is that little boys that are young, 4 to 5 to 6 to 7 years old, really aren't interested in doing the 6-minute walk test, and very likely will stop in the middle and say, this is over and I'm bored, or I don't really want to complete it. And furthermore, what we also understood is that you can encourage them. So we did a small study to demonstrate that the 6-minute walk test could be impacted by really incentivizing the boys. So we had them do the 6-minute walk test, and then we put a $50 bill on the table and say, can you do it again? And in fact, there was a 100-meter difference. So you can incentivize, and even in the midst of muscle degradation, you can get that adrenaline moving to accomplish a task that will demonstrate its lack of sensitivity. So in our preference study, what we learned is measures such as walking is important, being able to go up a curb so that they could walk across the street, being able to get up from a chair is really important because as they sit in school. So we were able then to work with PTs in Europe and in the United States to develop a measure now called the North Star assessment, or the NSAA, which is a global assessment. And even in that, looking very specifically of what matters and be able to predict, for instance, now we can predict that if a child cannot get off his feet for supine to standing in 5 seconds, that it will be unlikely that he will walk 18 months longer. So we are now getting very specific, and this interaction with the FDA helped us understand what they were requiring and helped them to understand what was important to our families. So the tadalafil study was a very interesting study, and you'll be surprised to know we're doing another study with tadalafil. And one of the learnings from that tadalafil study is we gave this drug in this clinical study was done in the absence of promoting exercise. So now we're doing a study really promoting some exercise, because in order for that PDE5 to work, you need to have muscle movement, so that it is able to increase the oxygen to the muscles, oxygen and nutrients. So it has been a learning along the way, but I think what we've enjoyed most is talking to the FDA about, does this work, and would you understand this? And having this bi-directional communication has really helped us advance the field.
Thank you. Definitely inspiring, certainly, and game changing in the sense that you really that communication with the FDA, I think, was really groundbreaking in terms of looking at developing treatment. So Phyllis, I'll turn to you, and I think really think about the groundbreaking work that you've led well before a molecule gets to the clinical stage, but looking at research in general. So tell us a little bit first about your career path and sort of what you thought you would be doing, and how that morphed into leading so many so much great work in sex differences.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate being included among the trailblazers. Thank you very much. So I was thinking about this, obviously, when I got this invitation, and I go back about, 40 years or more. I went back to school after I had my 3 children to get an MSW, and I ended up getting an internship at the American Psychiatric Association. And because I was older than the rest of the staff, I got friendly with the women psychiatrists. And I started hanging out with them a little bit, and I heard them complaining about the fact that even though women got depression and anxiety more than men, they weren't in the clinical trials. They were complaining about tenure, they were complaining about publication and being published, and it was clear that there was sexism. There had been no head of the APA that was a woman, and so that was, I guess, my first entry or knowledge about just in terms of professional of positions. Then it turned out I got very friendly with a psychiatrist in particular, and she invited me to a meeting on AIDS. This was at the very beginning of the AIDS epidemic. And there was a group of women, I believe all physicians or scientists, complaining about the fact that the tests and the research was only being done on men and pregnant women. They weren't paying any attention to women. And as it turned out later on, that the symptoms were different. I mean, there were real sex differences, but it didn't even occur to them to look at women. At that meeting, I was introduced to a woman, a physician, who had worked at the NIH and discovered, and this was NHLB, not the heart one, the one that it's now called the Shriver. It was children's.
Yeah, NICHD.
And she was there, and she was upset because the focus was really only on maternal issues and children. There was no focus on all the other conditions that affect women, cardiovascular, osteoporosis, whatever. So she started this volunteer organization called Society for the Advancement of Women's Health Research. And so I was part of this volunteer organization. It was doctors and scientists. And then I got very involved with the Clinton campaign. And I forgot this. So I hosted a meeting for Hillary very early on in the campaign. And Hillary gave a presentation about, how they were going to travel around the country, and Bill was going to do all this other stuff. And I went over to her after her presentation and introduced myself and said, if you're going to be going around the country talking to women, you really ought to think about talking about women's health. So sure enough, knowing Hillary, she called me the next day in the office. I missed the call, but then her assistant called me and asked if I would work with them on women's health. And of course, I said I would. And as it turned out, since I was at the APA, I started doing mental health issues for Tipper. So that's things just, one thing just happened after another without, there was no planning whatsoever. Actually, what I'm most proud of is during the dinner after Clinton's inauguration, Hillary came over to me. He mentioned something about women's health, and Hillary came over to me and said, that was because of you. So I figured, so that was pretty special. Anyway, so because I had gotten involved in the Clinton campaign, and Hillary did they both made women's health. It was mostly focused on breast cancer, Nancy Brinker and stuff, but still there was at least some acknowledgement about women's health. At a board meeting, I suggested that the society become a full-fledged organization instead of it being a volunteer, that it should be, a nonprofit, 501c3, and really, use the foundation that Hillary and the Clinton administration to really, get the word out. So they took 6 months to look around for a CEO, and they finally settled on me. And I mean, what my argument was, which obviously was true, was that the other board members were scientists and physicians, and of course, brilliant and wonderful, but they didn't know Washington. I had been a lobbyist for the American Psychiatric Association, and my husband was a well-known journalist. And I had also run the Political Action Committee for the APA. So I knew the members of Congress. And so my pitch was, I need you guys for the information and the education, but I know Washington. And that was the beginning of that. So I got home that day after they decided that I'll be CEO. I got home that day and I said to my husband, I have good news and bad news. And he said, what? I said, the good news is they picked me as CEO. The bad news is we have no money. We had no money, we had no office, we had nothing. So that's another whole story. But one of the things that was interesting, well, because I lobbied for the APA, and there were I knew a lot of the drug companies, and because the things were different then. When you went to the fundraisers, really they had one, and there were very few, and the money was, you know, like $500 was like the most you could give. So it was no big. It was very different then. But I had gone to all these fundraisers with people that represented different pharmaceutical companies, so I got friendly with them. And one of the things that was interesting among many was that a lot of the people that were in the advocacy offices in Washington were women, young women. And when I started talking to them about the fact that women weren't in any of the studies and that nobody was paying any attention, I don't know what they did, but they somehow got all their companies, including Lilly when you were there, to start funding the society. And after a while, we became a real organization and really, you know, accomplished quite a lot. As you know, that's probably your next question, right?
Well, we'll get to that. But yeah, so that's, I mean, certainly all of you have had these incredible careers and have had the opportunity to really be game changers. Julie, you and I were visiting, I don't know, maybe when we were in Atlanta together for Georgia Bio or something, and you talked to me of this anecdote. So Tommy Thompson, when he was secretary, HHS, said something to you, Julie, about being in leadership and being well liked, or something along those lines with regard to CDC. I don't know if you recall that story, or you mind sharing a little bit more about that here.
Well, sure. Secretary Thompson, otherwise now known as Governor Thompson, who served as the leader of Wisconsin for many years before he came to Washington, had a number of little leadership sound bites. Probably the one I remember the best was when he looked me straight in the eye and he said, Julie, if you're not on the edge, you are taking up too much room. And that visual imagery of, you know, leaning into change and leadership in some really complicated times has stuck with me ever since. But you know, the secretary really did have, I think, a fairly deep understanding of our public health system, maybe because he'd been a governor and had dealt with the welfare system in Wisconsin and some of the other things that were, you know, fairly progressive for that period of time. He believed very strongly, even then, that the CDC really needed to modernize in a lot of ways. And I think that's what he was hoping I would be able to catalyze or initiate when I went to Atlanta. And, you know, I didn't grow up in public health per se, but I worked in a city hospital that was the hospital of last resort for many people in San Francisco whose illnesses really were representative of failures in the public health system, or at least failures of prevention. So I had a strong belief and understanding of why public health was critical. But it, you know, the CDC is full of outstanding sciences and scientists and laboratories. And it seems like kind of the mecca of public health science. And yet the translation of that science into meaningful programs in the front lines in our states, territories, tribes, and local health departments just was not very effective. So we really did need to tackle that. And I think that was what the secretary was saying to me, that this is going to be a hard job. And if you get the job started, you're not going to be popular. And so, you know, how thick is your skin and are you up for it? And, you know, it's very sobering, kind of challenging conversation. But I think the alliance and the motivation was there, as I knew how important it was. And keep in mind, I came into this job in the context of the anthrax attack. So I was very concerned about biosecurity, biosafety, and the overall relationship of public health to national security. So it seemed like it was really important work, and being popular was not my priority. It doesn't say that you don't feel it when some people aren't happy with the decisions you're making or the changes you're supporting, but nevertheless, I felt like I did the best I could to build consensus, and it's it's a journey. That's the way I would probably leave it.
Definitely. So for a number of the patient advocacy groups that are here and who will watch this recording later on, they may not necessarily be familiar with the Foundation for NIH. So I wonder, in your new role, it's not so new anymore, but and for those of you who may not be aware, Julie was the vice chair, the co-chair of the Bio Patient Advocacy Board Committee. So has long been a champion for certainly the patient advocacy community. So talk to us a little bit about FNIH, what you do, and then also the initiative you're leading on patient engagement.
Thank you. So real quickly, the Foundation for the NIH is a 501c3 that was authorized by Congress to help the NIH accomplish its mission, and particularly accomplishing it by helping them develop partnerships and raise resources that they could not really be appropriated. It's very difficult for the government to work with the private sector, as many of you no doubt appreciate. So the main thing that the FNIH is doing to help the NIH is to build these pre-competitive, fairly large-scale private-public partnerships with the life sciences companies, with academicians, and with patient organizations and small and large foundations. So, for example, this past year we launched the Bespoke Gene Therapy Consortium, which is a set of 8 clinical trials with gene therapy for rare diseases. And that involves 10 NIH institutes and many patient organizations, not necessarily just the organizations that are interested in a specific gene therapy for the focal area of their effort, but rather a recognition that by working together, including with the FDA and NIH, we would be able to define the manufacturing standards for gene vectors so that each little company didn't have to try to invent their own pathway through the FDA. And likewise, we could develop more regulatory certainty around how to get drugs approved for rare disease when you can't do a randomized placebo-controlled clinical trial for obvious reasons. So the idea in that particular platform partnership is that the rising tide will float all boats, and the work that's going on there will serve as exemplars in helping FDA establish a framework guidance for these challenging areas. And we have similar things in biomarkers and a very large set of programs in a variety of therapeutic areas that are called the AMPs, the Accelerating Medicine Partnerships, that are looking for new targets and new pathways in the pre-competitive space. So a lot of interest from life science companies in that space as well. Just to back up a little bit though, like, why am I such a patient advocate? The first thing I'll say is, having been brought up as an intern when 17 out of 22 patients on my service had AIDS complications and were dead within 6 months, really experienced the lack of medicine, but the wonderful generosity of my patients in teaching me the art of medicine, even when the science was lacking, and the importance of the holistic context of illness and community and family and loved ones, etc. So they were great teachers, and I learned lessons that I will hopefully never forget. And when I left to go to the CDC, I think I still carried that, patient in front of me mentality, even though I was working on population health issues. When I went to bio as a Merck representative to the bio board, I was impressed with the importance of the work that bio is leading in the patient community, and the notion of really having a very assertive integration of patients with lived experiences and patient perspectives. And that was kind of happening at the same time that FDA was evolving its expectations of greater inclusion and relevance to patient communities. So I was really honored to co-chair the patient organization at Bio. When I went to FNIH last year, they too really care about the patients as the ultimate recipient of anything good that comes of these partnerships, but we didn't really have a bright lens shining on it. So I very quickly brought the person from Merck, who was my deputy chief patient officer, basically, Jan Nissen, to help us establish a more focused patient perspective at FNIH. Tanya Kumphaus is the person who leads our internal efforts. She's really leaning now into that being almost her full-time job. So we have created a patient ambassador program to help encourage people to understand and participate in clinical research in an equitable way. We've also created a patient advisory board to bring a variety of patient advocates, but also people with lived experiences to look at our programs and our protocols from end to end and really help us start at the very beginning with the patient's perspectives in mind, so that we don't just check a box when we're ready to launch our project or whatever. So we've really embraced this point of view in a more formal way. And again, it's a journey. We're not there yet, but we really look forward to any advice or input that any of you might have for us as we work our way through a ever-growing list of therapeutic areas, and hopefully broadening our gene therapies, including AAV vector therapies, but also now non-AAV and non-cellular therapies are coming into focus for us through our partnership. So much work to do, but it's a passion. So hopefully we'll make progress.
Thank you. Exciting. And Swapna put into the chat, if anybody has questions or comments for any of the speakers, please feel free to just speak up at any time. It's not a formal thing. Otherwise I'll keep chatting. And I know there are a couple folks on the line. I won't call on them just in case they're multitasking, but who have worked on FNIH projects, and with whom I worked on several projects, and Phyllis too, certainly in your sarcopenia definition a number of years ago. So FNIH has really deep relationships, and the pre-competitive nature of it has been incredibly important from an industry partnership perspective. So Phyllis, over the years, you have led many projects and a number of many scientific roundtables, all kinds of things. As you look at the impact that you've made on sex differences research, women's health research, what would you say your sort of crowning achievements have been?
Well, I guess certainly getting women in clinical trials. I mean, it's hard to believe, but up until around 1990, women were not in clinical trials. And I've been working on this now, well, it's 2023, and we still have disparities in terms of minorities and women. So I think overall, the main achievement was hopefully bringing to the world's attention that men and women were different, and that their brains, their hearts, their bones, that everything was different, and that medications and devices needed to be tested on women as well as and minorities, of course. But not only that, and this is an area that really still needs focus, is that even though if you have the representation in the trials, if they don't analyze the differences, then it really doesn't give you the answer. And even at the FDA, in spite of all the good work that they do, and that was mentioned, they've published these snapshots on their website to show who was in the trials of recently approved therapeutics. And they will have minorities and will have women in it, but 9 times out of 10, it's not clinically relevant to the minorities and to the women, and they haven't done research. So there may be differences. Why are there differences, and what does that mean? And then the other thing, obviously, and this was sort of serendipitous. We had once, when I was then the CEO of the society, one of my board members who used to work at the National Academy suggested that I go to the Institute of Medicine to see if we could do something with them on getting women in clinical trials. Because we were focused obviously on women's health, but it was just sort of us around the table. So I went to the academy, and I didn't realize that, and I was told, I met with Andy Pope, who's still there, and I suggested that the Institute of Medicine look at women in clinical trials and women's research. And he was intrigued by the idea, but he said that they can only do projects that are requested by government agencies. They could not just do a project for a nonprofit organization. So then, but it turns out, and you mentioned my book, he's in the book, he was intrigued by the idea. He thought it was interesting and he wanted to pursue it. So I tried to raise money from the Institute, and I was successful on 3 of them because I knew the directors. And then he went to some of the scientific organizations to get them to fund it. And this was really the important thing, because the scientific organizations, the academy and some of the other science agencies said, well, we'll only support it if you look at basic science. So we had started out just looking at the inclusion in clinical trials, but because of the funding that we were getting from the basic science organizations, they required that we look at it, way before the clinical trials. And 6 years later, we had an IOM report said biological contributions to human health, does sex matter? And the answer was every cell has a sex, and women need to be diagnosed from womb to tomb. So that was how we got from clinical trials into basic biology.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that. Pat, I'll come back to you. You talked about starting PPMD. You made it sound so easy, but you also talked about in the beginning really being the postdoc rather than the mom who was showing obvious emotion and passion for the work that you're doing. How did you first establish those relationships with the industry and foster them moving forward? Julie referenced sometimes it is challenging for public-private partnerships, but when you think about a nonprofit organization and industry partnership, how did that really start for you?
Michelle, I think first of all, in rare diseases established and support research in academic centers typically. And the struggle for any rare disease is you have to find the person who's interested or knows a little bit or has published, or you can recruit, right? So you have to look for those individuals and recruit them, essentially, support the research. So as you support basic science to begin to characterize a disease, once there is characterization of the disease, natural history of the disease, then we do see industry interest. And what we have done is really in the beginning been introduced by the people we supported in basic science, because industry came to them. Over time, then we established tools like animal colonies that we would support, and both large and small animal colonies. And that way, in our support for that, the basic scientists would have to come to us and say, this small startup wants to use our colony, and we could save them money in terms of industry investment versus our investment in support of that colony. So I think it was sort of as things evolved, we were introduced through the academic research, and then especially as word got out about what we're doing, industry would come to us and still does come to us. And then as we interacted, first of all, in policy, and we were able to, with our champions in Congress, write the Muscular Dystrophy Care Act, was introduced and signed into law in 2001. And that really resulted in the NIH investment. And the NIH investment really was very compelling for not only academia, but industry. And I think that legislation was the tipping point for industry to come into play and to begin to see this as a viable place where they could develop therapies. I think the other thing we did to interest industry is in our organization, we have what's called the Duchenne Drug Development Roundtable, or like everything in Washington deserves an acronym, DDDR. And in the DDDR, we really engage with companies in the pre-competitive space to say, what do you need? Is it preference studies? Is it registry? Can we help you with the data from our registry of 5,000 patients? What are those, we talk about payers. I mean, we talk about therapy development from beginning to end. And so what we've done is create opportunities within there, and we report back our interactions with FDA, our preference studies. And finally, we've written draft guidance for FDA. We felt like they and industry and academia needed to know sort of state of the art. So we submitted that to the docket in 2016 and have just updated the guidance, adding in gene therapy and cardiac, and now that's being published. So I think we found novel ways from the DDDR to academia to policy to preference studies, and engaging in developing that guidance. We had 300 people, patients, industry, academia, working on that document. So I think it's how do you engage that community in a variety of ways that people within the community will find a place to land.
Yeah, and who the community is, what the community is. So to your point, rare disease does have the additional challenge of relatively rare investigators as well. Have any questions come in, Swapna, or anybody that wants to ask a question?
Yeah, we actually have, well, one person asked 2 questions. I can just read it out.
Sure.
So this is for any of the presenters from Kira. I would like to know what each organization represented here can be doing to help women feel seen and heard by healthcare providers and researchers. And then her second question is, are there currently any efforts to teach young women about patient advocacy and the importance of women being represented in research as a part of a high school curriculum?
May I answer that?
Sure.
I'm not sure about the high school curriculum, but there are a couple of things going on. First of all, you may be aware of the White House's initiative on research on women. So as you know, since I've been doing this since 1990, it's been a long time, and it's about time that the White House took a role in this, but they seem to be really focusing on research and what needs to be done. So that's the good news, and I do hope that whatever their initiative is, right now they're meeting and they haven't come out with anything. Our group, I'm with Healthy Women now, Healthy Women and a lot of other women's groups and women's and disease groups have sent information to them, and hopefully that they will incorporate it in some way. The other thing is, and Michelle, if I can put a print for my book.
Yeah, and Swapna will put a link in. Yep.
My book is coming out in April. It's called Sex Cells, CELLS. Being published by Mayo. And the reason I bring it up is because it is educational. It's about the road it took all these years and how we managed to get where we are, but also how much further we have to go. So I would say that we were successful in the recognition, at least for the most part. And there are still cardiologists out there who were trained, 20 years ago, who still don't realize that women have heart attacks. But that I believe this book really brings to focus how difficult it was and what the problems still are. And I hope it's educational for pre-med and physicians and nurses, anybody in the healthcare field, as well as the individual woman who reads it, to make sure that when she goes to the doctor, she's asking the right questions, whether the medication was tested on women, whether the dosage should be different. You need to ask these questions. And I don't know how many doctors out there will really have the answers, but at some point they better.
Thank you for that. Absolutely. I'll switch a little bit. Patty DeLoach is on the line, and I think anybody who knows Washington and women leaders in Washington on the Hill certainly knows Patty. And so Patty, I've had some wonderful conversations, and wondered if you could talk about sort of being really a junior staffer on the Hill as a woman and kind of coming up through leadership and sort of your Hill career from that perspective. I think it'd be really inspiring and informative for folks who are coming into this field.
Oh, thank you, Michelle. And this has just been an excellent discussion, and I have learned so much just by listening to these three very powerful women. And thank you all for taking the time to talk to us today. I worked on Capitol Hill for 26 years and started out as a legislative correspondent, and just really took an interest in healthcare. And what was so fascinating about healthcare back
Unknown
then
caller.
is the fact that there were no men who wanted to work on healthcare. And so by default, because I was a woman, I was able, I took this incredible portfolio and learned a lot about the issues. And then Phyllis, I remember that I worked for two members of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, and I remember there being a hearing in the House Energy and Commerce Committee regarding women's, just the clinical trials and the lack of women participating in these clinical trials. And I know you were the force behind that, and thank you for that, because that was a very powerful hearing. And excuse me, sorry, I'm recovering from a cold. And then it was, and my former boss, Mike Bilirakis, he was the Energy and Commerce Health Subcommittee chair at the time, and the father of Gus Bilirakis, who serves on the Energy and Commerce Committee. He really thought it was important to understand the science. And I remember us going to NIH and talking to the directors of NCI, of infectious disease, and talking to Dr. Fauci about his work in HIV/AIDS and just the promising research in cancer. And also he really thought it was important to understand more about CDC. And so, I truly believe that there are a lot of members still on Capitol Hill and staff who respect science. And we cannot be discouraged by the media reports and some of the outlandish comments that are made. The silent majority still respects science, and I think it's really important to educate. And I also, just the other thing that I wanted to point out, when I worked for Mike Bilirakis, I was his chief of staff eventually, and I was Senator Orrin Hatch's health policy director. Some of the most compelling meetings that I had, with the senator was with people like you, Pat, who brought to our attention these rare diseases and conditions and the promising research and the promising therapeutics out there, and how important it is to fund that research and to support that research. And to me, what I think is really important is taking the time. We met with a lot of organizations on Capitol Hill, but taking the time, it really doesn't fall on deaf ears. Taking the time to go up and educate Congress and talk to Congress about these rare disorders and diseases and these important health policy discussions, and just giving, showing that there is promise in these areas. So I just, we can't get discouraged. We have to keep trying and working towards, just finding policy solutions in these areas. So I hope, Michelle, I hope that's helpful. I don't know if there's anything else you wanted me to cover.
Well, are there any questions? Thank you, Patty, so much. Are there questions from anyone in the audience?
Michelle, could I just say, I really feel the sense of optimism in your reminder that there is a silent majority when it comes to really trusting and wanting science to have an important foundational role in policy evolution. And I do just want to ask everyone to check out the website Coalition for Trust in health and science, because there are now more than 100 organizations that have signed on to really tackle this whole issue collaboratively. We're building a compendium of the research that's going on and how to deal with earning trust, combating misinformation, etc., but also finding ways to share the talking points, or at least alert people what the surveillance is telling us about dangerous misinformation or disinformation as it's circulated. So this is not an advertisement for that, but I think it's a really important and evolving effort to build a network of people in that silent majority group who can really touch and influence a lot of other people.
Thank you so
Patty,
much.
I just wanted
Julie.
to I
Go
just
ahead,
wanted to say that, Patty, you and the Billeracas office have been incredible in terms of rare disease research, and I just wanted to thank you. I think that Mr. Billeracas has just really embraced rare disease, and you have pushed it forward, and I just am deeply indebted for all you've done. Thank you.
And just to be clear, I'm an alum of the Billeracas office. I feel like I'm part of their team, but I thank you for saying that. And Senator Hatch was very committed to rare disease research as well. And you had, you had his full support as well.
Yeah, it was amazing. And I think seeing those champions, all of you really signing on and being champions for rare diseases has really advanced the ball here for so many of us. And we clearly have lots of work to do, but it really was amazing to watch. So thank you.
Yeah, and the junior Bill Rackus, Gus received an acknowledgement just last week or earlier this week. Gosh, the weeks go by so fast and yet so slow for his leadership. So excellent. Well, this has been an amazing conversation. I cannot thank you enough for being part of it. I hope that you all take something away from the discussion. We'll share the link with you so you can share it with others in case they may want to catch up with us. But thank you so much to Julie, Pat, and Phyllis for giving us your morning. Thank you so much for joining, those of you on the line. And again, the trust in science is really important. Bio is also part of the effort. And so we'll make sure that everybody sees that link many times more. So I hope you all have a wonderful holiday season. We will be kicking off the year with our first patient advocacy event in January on the 25th. If I have that date right, Swapna. And you'll be getting an invitation to that. It will be an early evening reception. We're calling it the Beat the Winter Blues post-holiday holiday party. So we hope to see you then, and we'll see you online before that, I'm sure. So take care, everybody.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Bio. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.